Here, look, as we call it, our still life segment, our photo of the day, obviously of the embattled New York Assembly Speaker Shelly Silver leaving his office at the Capitol building this week. Silver, as you know, being removed from his post after being arrested on federal corruption charges. His successor set to be announced in 2 weeks, the election February 10th. Now, he's taking a leave of absence from his law firm, Whites in Luxembourg, as well as he fights the charges. Authorities say that the 70-year-old Shelly Silver took nearly $4 million in payoffs and kickbacks. Some of the charges allege that Silver collected money for securing state grants for a doctor who then referred cases to the firm of his choice. Authorities also go on to claim that Silver used his power to convince 2 real estate developers to hire a Manhattan real estate firm, which allegedly then paid Silver $700,000 for the referrals. Goes on to claim here that Silver also directed $500,000 in state grants to pay for research of an oncologist who would then refer asbestos victims to a law firm that in turn paid Silver nearly $4 million for referrals and another $1.4 million for legal work, which officials say he never performed. Let's bring in our panel. Jimmy Kasouras, criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, lecturing at New York Law School and also a visiting professor at the University of Birmingham in England. Mark Furnish, professor at Brooklyn Law, has also argued for the U.S. Supreme Court, and we'll be talking about the High Court a little bit later in the hour. And Bill Aronwald, criminal defense attorney and former federal prosecutor. He's kind enough to join us as well. And I asked you before on a personal level, since you worked with the man for 28 years, when you heard or read the complaint and also saw it delivered with that press conference, it was notable, and I'll go around the table, did you say to yourself, they got him, or that's going to be a tough case to prove? Both.
There are the theft of honest services charges, which were what Joe Bruno was convicted of and then acquitted of.
Yep.
It's a vague law, and the evidence is not strong. On the extortion pieces, which is essentially the doctor, the referrals, the public money going over, and the re-referrals, it's a strong case. But as I said before, whatever the legal basis, ethically it stinks, and people reacted to the ethical part.
Stay on the legal side. I've also heard, Jimmy, that a lot of defense attorneys that work in malpractice, they're concerned here how this shakes out could have consequences beyond just this case.
Well, in terms of referrals and so on and so forth, just going back to the Silver situation, I think that the conduct is going to be very easy to prove. I'm not so sure that whether it's corrupt or not legally is going to be so easy. Look, the referral situation is easy. The line is clear. If you're associated with a firm, you're allowed to get referral fees without doing work. If you are not associated with the firm, then you're not allowed to get referral fees unless you work on the case, and then the fees that you get have to be proportional to the amount of work you put in. In the first instance here, he was clearly associated with Whites. That was on the record. That was disclosed. He's allowed to get referral fees. That was legal and not necessarily unethical.
Just from the layperson, though, Jimmy, when I see that $500,000 of taxpayer money that was in a discretionary fund, albeit, but in a fund, was used by a lawmaker to, if you believe the complaint, certainly profit himself, right? And there was a quid pro quo, and the attorney, as we know, is already flipped here, and he's working with the U.S. attorney.
Right.
I give you $500,000 for research. Apparently hard money and grants to come by, at least as it relates to mesothelioma, like how I pronounce that. And all of a sudden it's coming through a second and a third party, and it's coming right in my pocket. It don't smell right, and I don't know how that's legal.
That's where I was going.
Yeah.
That's the corrupt part. That's the part that you're not allowed to do. And these funds, my understanding is, were within his control. These were discretionary funds that he was allowed. That's right. So it was very easy for him to designate those funds. That's the bad part. Getting the referral fee without the other part is fine. But the quid pro quo, if proven, there's your crime.
You agree, Mark?
Well, I sort of agree with what Richard said at the start, and I take your point about the depletion of taxpayer funds, but what about the depletion of taxpayer funds that's about to ensue in prosecuting a statute that is among the most vague statutes on the federal books through rounds and rounds of appeals, going all the way up? We just had Skilling in 2010 that took this statute all the way up to the Supreme Court. None of the convictions, well, some of them stuck, but the great bulk of them were thrown out. We had 2 trials with Bruno, 2 appeals. Nothing happened of it. We're throwing good money after bad here. And why? Look, nobody thinks that Shelly Silver is the cleanest person. Everyone knows that Albany, in part, significant part, is a cesspool of corruption. But what about the motives of not the line assistants bringing this charge, but Preet Bharara with the press conference? You know, I don't know anything about Preet Bharara, but there's a great danger of over-federalizing things, over-criminalizing things, for ambitious prosecutors to make names for themselves. It wasn't
Maybe
a federal
so. And as a
prosecutor, but it was Elliot Spitzer.
As former federal prosecutor yourself, I know that there's a bit of stage work to this, and there was a lot of it that we saw from him. But I'm sorry, as a constituent, as a citizen of the state here, I don't want people doing what allegedly he did. And I don't want leadership doing it. And I don't want that to be the new example or the standard. And also, to Richard's point, and I'm glad the other two cynics were at the table, but I do believe that most of these guys are good guys. But if the cue you're getting is from above, this is how I do business, and I'm going to be the ones attaching who gets chairmanships, who gets Lulus, who gets whatever else, spend the money. Even if it's 5-1 in terms of return, but make an example if you have to.
I look at the statute a little bit differently than Mark and Jim do. First off, in the context of this case, I don't think there's anything at all vague about the statute. The Supreme Court has said that in order to convict somebody of services fraud, honest services fraud, the government must prove beyond a reasonable doubt a quid pro quo arrangement resulting in a bribe or a kickback to a public official. This complaint, like it or not, meets that standard. Whether the government has the proof to establish it and sustain the burden.
We already have the cooperation of the doctor, right?
Something absolutely correct. But the other part of this is, and I think this is something that I find very striking, is it is unusual in the extreme for a prosecutor to start a case out with a 35-page complaint where the 5 charges are set forth in the first 3 or 4 pages of the complaint. The other 30 pages lay out all of the evidence that was uncovered in the investigation, the kind of information you would never get in an indictment, the kind of information you wouldn't get in pretrial discovery, but the kind of information that an agent would have to put forth at an affidavit if he was looking for a search warrant or an eavesdropping warrant. The U.S. Attorney was sending a message to Sheldon Silver when he proceeded with this 35-page complaint. He's telling him, this is what I have. I'm giving you a chance now to roll over and flip or go to trial. The government is looking for Shelly Silver to work a deal.
And that's a perfect segue, Richard. And we've explained earlier in this program that if you do a deal, you got to admit to everything in New York State here. You don't get to have a meeting unless you say everything that you know of, both you personally were involved or others to this.
I haven't the slightest idea.
I understand.
I've never been in that room.
Okay. To that end.
You weren't one of the 3 guys.
Here's what I don't understand. We saw with Michael Grimm, I know a different situation, but wouldn't you have argued if you were counseling Shelly Silver, especially as I understand the rules, and you've forgotten more than I do as to how Albany works in terms of this, but as Speaker, if he wanted to hold on to his leadership position, even in the face of public and even backroom fighting to get him out the door, it seems that he could have put up a bigger fight than he did if he didn't want to go quietly into the night. Wouldn't he have had more leverage if he was first Speaker?
That's
and
a
done
political question, and the question is
I
why
ain't
he
talking about
offered
foreign politicians,
why he offered the five-man committee.
Right.
It was a sign of weakness. It was a political mistake. But Bill's point, I think I agree with, but for different reasons. The reason he put all that in there was to get the amount of money up to $4 to $5 million, which, if you then look at the sentencing guidelines, have Shelly looking at 10 to 15 years. That's the implied threat. And if you also listen to Bharara, he says, stay tuned, because the other people who are supposed to read that complaint are the members of the Senate, the governor's office. There's bigger fish to fry. There's more to come, and I suspect it's going to come more quickly than anyone thinks.
Yeah, but I disagree with you only in this sense. I don't think the U.S. Attorney is at all concerned with getting across to Shelly Silver what the guideline range would be. He's got a lawyer that will do that. I think what this is all about is the U.S. Attorney's Office feels that Shelly Silver holds the key to opening the door to all sorts of political corruption, and he can give that information. But to Richard's point, what has to be remembered here is the way the government works. If Mark Furnish wants to come in with a client and wants to offer that client's cooperation to me,
Not me.
I'm not, okay, not you, but okay, Jim or some other lawyer, basically what's going to happen is I, as the prosecutor, are going to require two things. Number one, your client has to tell me everything he knows about anybody that committed a crime in Albany or anywhere else, but also he's going to have to tell me everything that he's done wrong in his lifetime, because he may know stuff that he did that I don't know of.
How much higher than Silver can you go, other than the governor? I mean, do we
Well,
think
the
it leads that
There
high?
are he didn't use the phrase 3 men in a room by accident.
Right. So you think it's Cuomo?
Shut
dare
your
you.
mouth.
But how much higher
I
can it
don't
go?
think it's Cuomo. I don't think it's Skelos. Bahara said 3 men in a room. What am I, a potted plant?
Yeah, but the government usually wants to trade up.
Yeah.
But when you have a guy like
right.
Shelly Silver, you can trade laterally and you can trade downward depending upon the quantity
scope,
of people
yeah.
that he can give up.
But he could have gone, listen, they could have gone to his lawyers earlier and made that deal without the splash.
They had to have done that, right?
They did
Right.
not.
And I
No?
have a, I
They
have a
never
different view.
contacted Shelly
That
Silver.
35-page complaint could be geared more towards the public
Yeah.
and
That's
towards
true, too.
the press conference and not necessarily
Jimmy, I
at
only talk
Shelly
about the
Silver.
world I know. In the world of media, you don't do a teaser at the end, stay tuned, unless you got something.
I
Or else
don't
he's gonna
disagree.
be a punching bag of, you know.
I don't disagree. Look, his guidelines, even on the $3.5 to $5 million, we just figured them out. Even with the abuse of public trust, you're talking about a level 23 with a plea. You're talking about 51 months. You're not talking about 10 to 15 years. The statutory stuff is irrelevant. It's the guidelines that matter. I'm not saying 51 months to a 70-year-old isn't a lot. I think that 35 pages was out there more for the press conference, more for the public than anything else.
If you read the newspaper reports and the campaign filings, what's going on. They're looking for people who use their campaign funds for private benefit. That's what the next round is supposed to be. And they're seeking out people whose campaign reports indicate they hired counsel. Bahara is real as a prosecutor. Whether he's real as a reformer or a white knight on a horse coming in to clean up system is to be seen. But when the man says stay tuned,
I agree.
stay tuned.
I agree.
And we ask you to stay tuned. We're going to say goodnight to Richard here. But up next, we're going to go to the highest court of the land here. And Mark's going to tell us what some people have opined about, which is how much does public opinion actually impact how the justices rule, and how much should it? Now, history says yes to the question I asked here, but we'll get into if that's good or bad for this country. Stay with us.